3 years ago, Karen Blake convinced the court to strip Jonathan Carter of his parental rights through a web of lies and manipulation. Today, the truth was about to come out. The towering marble courthouse loomed before 12-year-old Julia Carter as she followed her mother up the stone steps. The crisp morning air did little to ease the anxiety twisting in her stomach. Karen walked confidently, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Dressed in expensive clothes, she exuded an air of self-importance. But her daughter, clad in oversized, fashionable clothes that seemed too big for a frail frame, was a stark contrast. "Good morning, Miss Blake." Julia, the calm voice of Thomas Hale, Karen's lawyer, greeted them at the entrance. His professional demeanor remained intact, though his gaze flickered with disapproval as he looked over Karen's extravagant attire. "Let's get this over with," Karen muttered, ushering Julia forward. As they passed through security, an officer paused, pulling a small flask from Karen's designer purse. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't bring this inside," he said, confiscating the item. Thomas sighed, his frustration barely concealed. Once they cleared security, he pulled Karen aside, his voice low and urgent. "What were you thinking bringing alcohol to court?" "I just forgot it was in my bag," she snapped. Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. "And your outfit?" "We discussed this. You need to appear modest, responsible." Karen cut him off. "I don't feel like being modest today. My ex-husband is a rich man, and I won't dress poor for anyone." Julia stood quietly, absorbing their conversation, while avoiding her mother's harsh gaze. "Did you hear what Mr. Hale said?" Karen suddenly snapped at Julia, grabbing her wrist. "You will stay quiet, and you will say that your condition is because of your illness, not neglect. Understood?" "Yes, mother," Julia whispered, the words falling from her lips like second nature. Karen leaned closer. "Repeat it." "Stay quiet and leave all talking to the adults," Julia murmured obediently. Satisfied, Karen turned back to Thomas, continuing their legal discussion. But as Julia stood there, a familiar figure caught her eye from across the hall. Her father, Jonathan Carter, stood at the far end of the hallway, deep in conversation with a woman Julia assumed was his lawyer. He looked different. His sharp suit was crisp, his posture upright, but his eyes were the same warm, kind brown she remembered. When their gazes met, he paused mid-sentence, his face softening into a warm smile. Julia hesitated before raising her hand in a small wave. Jonathan returned the gesture, his expression filled with quiet hope. Her heart pounded. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. Before she could think twice, she glanced at her mother, who was still deep in conversation with Thomas, and silently slipped away. She weaved through the crowd, her small frame making it easy to disappear. Within moments, she reached her father, who knelt down, opening his arms without hesitation. She rushed into his embrace, burying her face in his suit jacket. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you too, sweetheart," Jonathan murmured, stroking her back gently. After a moment, he pulled back to look at her. "Your wig looks nice. You look like a princess." Julia blushed, self-conscious about the baldness hidden beneath the synthetic hair. "Thanks," she mumbled, hugging him again. "How are you doing?" Jonathan asked gently. "Any updates from the doctor?" "The chemo is still going," she said hesitantly. "But I've been sick a lot. I miss a lot of school. Mom gets mad when I can't go." Jonathan's expression darkened. "She gets mad?" Julia nodded, but quickly changed the subject. "I miss your house. The pool. Can I come swimming again soon?" Jonathan smiled, though sadness flickered in his eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart. After today, we might be able to see each other more." Julia's expression shifted. "Why today?" Jonathan took a deep breath and knelt so he could be at eye level with her. "Let me tell you a story." Julia loved her father's stories. She listened intently as he began. "There were 2 birds taking care of their baby chick," he said. "One was very focused on building a fancy nest, always busy making it look impressive. But while that bird was busy, it sometimes forgot to feed the baby. The other bird, though, spent all its time making sure the chick was fed and cared for." Julia frowned. "What happened to the baby bird?" One day, an old wise owl, the judge of the birds, came to the nest. Jonathan continued. It had to decide which bird was taking better care of the chick. Julia's eyes widened. Is that what's happening today? Jonathan nodded. Something like that, yes. For a moment, Julia was quiet, absorbing the weight of his words. Then she looked back toward her mother, who was still engaged in her heated conversation with Thomas. Mom says you're always working, she said softly, that you won't have time for me if I live with you. Jonathan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me, Julia. No matter what happens, you will always be my top priority. Yes, I work hard, but I will always have time for you. He gave her a reassuring smile. We'll figure out together, okay? Julia hesitated before nodding. A small smile returned to her lips. Before they could talk further, a sharp voice cut through the hallway. Where's my daughter? Karen's furious tone sent a shiver down Julia's spine. She barely had time to step back before her mother stormed across the hall, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her away from Jonathan. Stay away from her, Karen hissed at Jonathan, venom in her voice. Or have you forgotten about the restraining order? Mom, stop. Julia protested weakly. Dad was just talking to me. Be quiet. Karen snapped, tightening her grip. Jonathan stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. Karen, let's be civil. We're in a courthouse. Karen's eyes blazed. You don't get to play the good guy now. You lost your rights 3 years ago. She is mine. As she dragged Julia away, Jonathan caught a whiff of something on her breath. His eyes narrowed slightly as he murmured, Have you been drinking again, Karen? The words hit Karen like a slap. Her face contorted with rage. How dare you, she spat. You're just making up lies to make me look bad. Jonathan's voice remained level. I'm just saying what I observe. Before Karen could respond, security officers arrived, stepping between them. What's going on here? One of them asked sternly. Karen pointed an accusing finger at Jonathan. He's violating the restraining order. Jonathan raised his hands. I was only talking to my daughter. The officers glanced between them, sensing the tension. Finally, one turned to Karen. Ma'am, we need you to calm down. Karen huffed but stepped back, pulling Julia with her. Come on, she snapped. We're going inside. As Julia was dragged away, she turned back to look at her father. He stood still, his expression unreadable, but when their eyes met, he subtly signed their secret message. I love you. Julia blinked back tears and nodded. As they entered the courtroom, she clung to those 3 silent words. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a solemn creak. Julia Carter swallowed hard as she stepped inside, her small frame stiff with anxiety. The imposing room stretched before her, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling making her feel even smaller. The judge's bench loomed at the front, where Judge William Hardy, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail, sat reviewing the case file before him. Carter versus Blake. The court clerk announced, All parties, please be seated. Karen Blake strode forward confidently, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she took her seat beside Thomas Hale. Across the aisle, Jonathan Carter settled into his chair, his lawyer Rebecca Green at his side. Julia was guided to a chair between her mother and her court-appointed advocate, Maria Thompson. Judge Hardy peered over his glasses, scanning the room. His gaze briefly settled on Julia, his expression softening before he addressed the courtroom. We are here today to revisit the custody arrangement between Ms. Karen Blake and Mr. Jonathan Carter concerning their daughter, Julia Carter. The purpose of this hearing is to determine what is in the best interest of the child. Karen sat with her chin lifted in defiance, while Jonathan remained composed, his hands resting on the table before him. Julia's fingers twisted nervously in her lap, the weight of the proceedings pressing down on her. Miss Green, Judge Hardy said, turning to Jonathan's lawyer, you may proceed with your opening statement. Rebecca stood, her voice calm and firm. Your Honor, over the course of these proceedings, we will present clear evidence of neglect and emotional harm suffered by Julia Carter while in the custody of her mother, Karen Blake. We will demonstrate that Ms. Blake has failed to provide consistent medical care for Julia's leukemia, has misused child support funds for personal expenses, and has engaged in behavior that puts Julia's well-being at risk. Today, we seek to correct the injustice done to Mr. Carter 3 years ago and ensure Julia's safety moving forward. As Rebecca took her seat, Karen's lawyer, Thomas, rose to deliver his statement. Your Honor, he began, smoothing his tie, Ms. Blake has been the primary caregiver for Julia since birth. While there have been challenges, she has done everything within her ability to provide for her daughter. The accusations against her are baseless and exaggerated, aimed at undermining her rights as a mother. We will prove that Julia's health struggles are due to her ongoing battle with leukemia, not neglect. We ask the court to uphold the original custody ruling in the best interest of the child. Judge Hardy nodded. Very well. Miss Green, you may call your first witness. Rebecca stood. Your Honor, we call Daniel Forrester, forensic accountant, to the stand. A man in a crisp suit approached, sworn in before taking a seat in the witness box. Mr. Forrester, Rebecca began, you were tasked with reviewing the financial records regarding Julia's care. Can you summarize your findings? Yes, he said, opening a thick file. Upon examination of Ms. Blake's bank statements, I found significant discrepancies. Thousands of dollars meant for Julia's medical treatment were instead spent on luxury purchases, including high-end clothing, jewelry, and vacations. Karen stiffened in her chair. That's ridiculous, she blurted out. Thomas quickly placed a hand on her arm, whispering for her to stay quiet. Rebecca continued, undeterred. Did you find evidence of Julia's medical expenses being neglected? Yes, Forrester confirmed. Several hospital bills went unpaid for months. Additionally, there were numerous late payments and inconsistent medical insurance contributions. The judge's gaze darkened as he reviewed the documents presented. Thank you, Mr. Forrester. You may step down. Rebecca stood again. Your Honor, we now call Julia's court-appointed advocate, Maria Thompson. Maria, a warm yet firm woman, took the stand. She looked at Julia before speaking. I have conducted multiple interviews with Julia, as well as home visits. Julia has expressed consistent fear of her mother's temper, describing instances where she was left alone for long periods or punished harshly. Additionally, I found that she often missed doses of her medication because the cabinet was kept locked. At this, Jonathan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Karen's face paled, but she remained silent, her nails digging into the tabletop. Rebecca nodded. Did Julia express a preference for where she would like to live? Maria took a deep breath. Yes, she wishes to live with her father. A stunned silence filled the room. Judge Hardy took a long pause before speaking. Ms. Blake, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Thomas stood. No questions, Your Honor. Karen shot him a glare, but remained quiet. The mounting evidence was beginning to crack her once unshakable confidence. We will now hear from the child, Judge Hardy announced. Julia Carter, please step forward. Julia's breath hitched. Maria squeezed her hand encouragingly before guiding her to the witness stand. As she sat, her small frame dwarfed by the massive chair, the courtroom seemed to press in around her. Judge Hardy's voice softened. Julia, I know this is hard, but I need you to tell us the truth. You are safe here. No one can hurt you for speaking honestly. Julia swallowed and nodded. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as she spoke. Mom! She forgets my medicine a lot. And when I'm sick, she gets angry. She says I should stop acting weak. Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes as he listened. Has your mother ever hurt you physically? Rebecca asked gently. Julia hesitated, then nodded. She hits me when she's mad. And she drinks a lot. When she does, she yells at me, calls me ugly because of my chemo. She says my wig is the only thing that makes me not embarrassing. A collective gasp filled the room. Karen jumped to her feet. That's a lie, she shrieked. She's making it up. Judge Hardy slammed his gavel. Ms. Blake, sit down or you will be removed from this courtroom. Karen dropped into her chair, seething with barely contained rage. Julia flinched but continued. She hit me earlier today, in the restroom. Jonathan's hands balled into fists. His lawyer placed a calming hand on his arm, reminding him to stay composed. Judge Hardy's gaze was unreadable as he looked at Karen. "Ms. Blake, is this true?" I was just disciplining her." Karen sputtered. She was being disrespectful. Rebecca's voice was like steel. "Hitting a sick child is not discipline. It's abuse." Judge Hardy sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That will be all for now. Julia, you may return to your seat." As Julia shuffled back to her chair, she risked a glance at her father. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. The truth was finally coming out. The courtroom was thick with tension as Julia Carter returned to her seat, her father's silent support giving her the courage to sit tall. Across from her, Karen Blake's face had lost its confidence, her fingers gripping the table as if she could hold her world together through sheer force. Judge William Hardy's gaze lingered on Julia for a moment longer before shifting to Karen. "Ms. Blake," he said, his tone measured, "in light of your daughter's testimony, do you have any response?" Karen straightened her posture, her lips pursing. "Your Honor," she began, her voice laced with feigned indignation. "Julia is a child. She has a very active imagination, and with all due respect, she's been manipulated by her father. He's filled her head with lies to turn her against me." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Judge Hardy silenced it with a sharp look. "Ms. Blake, do you have any evidence to counter the testimony provided?" Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning to her lawyer, Thomas Hale, who quickly stood. "Your Honor, we request that Julia's testimony be taken with consideration of her ongoing medical treatment," Thomas said smoothly. "Leukemia treatments are known to cause fatigue, memory lapses, and emotional distress. Her statements could be influenced by these factors." Rebecca Green, Jonathan Carter's lawyer, immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to discredit a brave child who just spoke her truth. Julia has been clear, coherent, and consistent in her statements." Judge Hardy nodded. "Objection sustained. I will not dismiss Julia's testimony due to speculation. Now, Ms. Green, do you have another witness to call?" Rebecca turned toward the gallery. "Yes, Your Honor. We called Dr. Evelyn Morris, pediatric oncologist, to the stand." A distinguished woman in a white lab coat stepped forward, taking the oath before sitting in the witness stand. "Dr. Morris," Rebecca began, "can you confirm that you've been treating Julia Carter for leukemia?" "Yes," Dr. Morris replied. "Julia has been under my care for 3 years. Throughout her treatment, I have monitored her physical and emotional well-being closely." Rebecca nodded. "In your professional opinion, has Julia ever shown signs of neglect or medical mistreatment?" Dr. Morris's expression darkened. "Yes, on multiple occasions. Julia has missed crucial chemotherapy sessions. There have been periods where her medication was not administered as prescribed, and in several instances, her wounds from treatment were left untreated, leading to infections." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Karen's face turned red, but she remained silent. Would this kind of neglect impact her health significantly? Rebecca pressed. Dr. Morris nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Delays in chemotherapy can reduce effectiveness, and infections in an immunocompromised patient like Julia are extremely dangerous. The inconsistency of her treatment is deeply concerning." Judge Hardy scribbled notes before lifting his gaze. "Ms. Blake, do you have any questions for the witness?" Karen clenched her fist but shook her head. "No, Your Honor." Rebecca stepped forward again. "Your Honor, at this time, we would like to present video evidence submitted by neighbors of Ms. Blake." The judge nodded, allowing the footage to be played. The screen flickered to life, showing Karen arriving home late at night, visibly intoxicated. Another clip showed Julia struggling to open a locked medicine cabinet, her small hands tugging desperately at the handle. Karen's lawyer, Thomas, leaped to his feet. "Objection. This is an invasion of privacy." Judge Hardy shook his head. "Objection overruled. This evidence is directly relevant to the child's well-being." Karen's confidence cracked. She turned toward Thomas, whispering furiously, but he merely shook his head. The evidence was damning. Rebecca spoke again, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, we rest our case. Judge Hardy exhaled, nodding. Mr. Hale, you may present your defense. Thomas rose slowly, adjusting his tie. He knew the case was slipping through his fingers, but he had one last play. Your Honor, my client maintains that she has done her best to care for Julia under difficult circumstances. While mistakes may have been made, they do not constitute neglect. Additionally, Mr. Carter has been absent for 3 years. How can he suddenly claim to be a better guardian now? Jonathan finally stood, his voice strong and unwavering. I never want to be absent. My rights were taken from me under false accusations, and I have fought every single day to get my daughter back. Everything I have done has been for her. Julia turned to look at her father, her eyes welling with tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Judge Hardy tapped his gavel. I will take a short recess before rendering my decision. As the courtroom emptied, Karen grabbed Julia's wrist, yanking her close. You ungrateful brat, she hissed. After everything I've done for you. A firm hand grasped Karen's wrist, pulling her away. Jonathan stood between them, his face dark with anger. You don't get to hurt her anymore, he said, his voice calm but deadly serious. Security moved in, escorting Karen back to her side of the courtroom. Julia clung to her father's sleeve, breathing heavily. Jonathan knelt in front of her. It's okay, he murmured. You're safe now. Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as she wrapped her arms around him. I want to go home with you, Dad. Jonathan hugged her tightly. I know, sweetheart. I know. The courtroom doors reopened, and Judge Hardy took his seat once more. Court is back in session. I am prepared to give my ruling. Julia held her breath as the moment of truth arrived. The courtroom fell silent as Judge William Hardy adjusted his glasses and shuffled the papers before him. The tension in the air was palpable. Julia Carter sat between her court-appointed advocate and her father's lawyer, her small hands clasped tightly together. Across the aisle, Karen Blake sat rigid, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. Jonathan Carter remained still, his face a mask of calm determination, but his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. Everything hinged on the next few moments. Judge Hardy exhaled, his sharp gaze moving between the two parents. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, I am ready to deliver my ruling. Karen straightened, forcing a smug smile onto her face. Thomas Hale, her lawyer, braced himself. Julia swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. The judge continued. The welfare of the child in question, Julia Carter, is the primary concern of this court. Throughout these proceedings, we have heard testimony from expert witnesses, reviewed financial and medical records, and listened to Julia's own account of her living situation. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before turning his attention to Karen. Ms. Blake, the evidence overwhelmingly shows a pattern of neglect, financial mismanagement, and emotional and physical abuse. Testimony from Julia's medical team confirms that she has missed critical treatments due to your failure to ensure her consistent care. Testimony from neighbors and video evidence further corroborate claims of habitual drinking and negligence. Karen's face paled, her lips parting as if to protest. But a quick glance from her lawyer silenced her. Judge Hardy then turned to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, it is clear that your parental rights were unjustly terminated in the previous ruling. You have demonstrated a consistent effort to be part of your daughter's life despite the legal restrictions placed upon you. Your determination to pursue this case and bring the truth to light has been noted by the court. Jonathan sat motionless, but Julia could see the barely restrained hope flickering in his eyes. She gripped the edge of her chair, barely breathing. Judge Hardy cleared his throat and spoke the words that would change their lives forever. Effective immediately, full legal and physical custody of Julia Carter is awarded to her father, Jonathan Carter. Ms. Blake's parental rights are hereby terminated. Furthermore, a restraining order will be issued against Ms. Blake, preventing any unsupervised contact with Julia. The room erupted. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Julia turned wide-eyed to her father, who remained frozen in place as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Karen shot up from her seat. No, you can't do this. She's my daughter, she shrieked. This is all lies. Judge Hardy's gavel slammed down. Order in the court. Security officers quickly approached Karen, who thrashed against them as they attempted to restrain her. This isn't over. You'll regret this, she screamed at Jonathan before being forcibly escorted out of the courtroom. The moment Karen was gone, Jonathan turned to Julia, his expression softening. Sweetheart, he whispered. Tears spilled from Julia's eyes as she threw herself into her father's arms. We won, she sobbed, her small frame trembling against him. I don't have to go back. Jonathan held her tightly, pressing a kiss to her head. No, sweetheart. You're safe now. You're coming home. Rebecca Green, Jonathan's lawyer, smiled warmly. Congratulations, Mr. Carter. Julia is finally where she belongs. Judge Hardy rapped his gavel once more. This court is adjourned. A new beginning. The crisp afternoon air felt different as Jonathan and Julia stepped out of the courthouse together. The weight that had sat so heavily on her young shoulders for years was suddenly lifted. She breathed deeply. For the first time in what felt like forever, without fear, Jonathan placed a protective arm around her. Are you ready to go home? He asked gently. Julia nodded, leaning into his side. Yes. As they walked toward his car, she glanced up at him, her voice small but sure. Dad. Yes, sweetheart. You won't ever leave me again, will you? Jonathan stopped, turning to face her fully. He knelt down, taking her hands in his. Never, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. You're my world, Julia. I will always be here for you. Julia smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. Okay, she whispered. Jonathan ruffled her hair. Now, what do you say we celebrate with ice cream? Julia giggled, her first real laugh in a long time. Strawberry? Anything you want. As they drove away from the courthouse, Julia gazed out the window, watching as the city blurred past. She wasn't just leaving a building. She was leaving behind years of fear and pain. And for the first time in years, she was heading home. Home where she belonged. Home where she was loved. And home where she was finally safe.